Okay, I guess we'll get started. My name is Risa Shimoda, I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society. Welcome. And you have arrived at the second of three Wild and Scenic webinars for 2025. And we're thrilled to be able to do this in partnership with some awesome experts that we have in their various fields. I think we can go ahead, John. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll be hearing about bank stabilization techniques on wild and scenic rivers. So this is both a topic in and of itself and specialized for the work that our speaker today will be talking about, who's worked on this on a project in conjunction with the National Park Service. So we thank them for their work as well. Go ahead. And like I mentioned, this is the second of three wild and scenic webinars that we have been hosting this spring. This one is obviously today, May 28th. We'll have one more in June, where we'll do sort of a crosswalk between visitor use management and that work and the important components of wild and scenic river management. Next slide. And here's our hero. He's going to be speaking with us today, John Field, who has helped us with both webinars, projects, and then short courses that he has held. We'll have another one that he's hosting in November, multi-day course. So I think we could maybe hand it over to you. Oh, here we go. No, one more thing. If you could share in the chat where you're coming from, where you are, what you'd like to make sure you learn, expectations. And then you, as you're muted now, if you have like a technical question, please, put that in the chat, like you can't read or can't hear, something like that. And then if you have we'll have stopping points for you to ask questions. And then either tomorrow or the next day, we'll have this recorded, posted in our River Training Center channel, and then we'll email you a notice that the recording is there in case you'd like to see it again, see part of it, or share it. Also, a session transcript will be available if you need it. So please let me know. Right now, also closed captioning is available. You have to choose that on your own screen, but it's available if you need. Okay, now we're ready for you, John. Yeah, you're muted. We need your microphone to work, and then.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Field. I'll be talking today about bank stabilization techniques on wild and scenic rivers. Basically, I'll be talking about a report, a National Park Service report that I produced in conjunction with Jim McCartney, who is with the National Park Service. He's in the audience today, so he can help answer questions as we move along as well. Together, Jim and I have over 70 years of experience working on rivers and streams, so you might say we know a thing or two about rivers, and hopefully we can share some useful information with you today. This is the cover of the report we will focus on today, best practices for managing bank erosion. Zoom in on it here. So this is available online. You can frantically try and write that down, um, or I'll show it later as well when we're answering questions, etc. But if you want to download the report, that is available free on the National Park Service website. The report is broken into three parts, sort of a fluvial geomorphology primer or river processes primer, basically explaining why rivers erode, why that's a natural process. Then the second part is if bank stabilization is needed. Then the second part sort of outlines how you select an appropriate bank stabilization technique. Uh, Again, within the context of wild and scenic rivers and National Park Service uh, context, if you will, but also useful anywhere in the world, essentially, in any environment. And then resources for studying the problem and selecting a technique to help you understand the erosion problem you're dealing with. Uh, there's a number of resources you can look at that we'll talk about briefly as I go through it. So basically, the talk today basically follows this outline. So I'll start with sort of a fluvial geomorphology primer and start with the statement that rivers are dynamic. They are changing their positions constantly in most cases. This is a map of the Mississippi River showing the shifting river channel positions over a 300-year time period. And you can see that the river channel position is changing, but the shape of the river is more or less the same. You have the meanders across the landscape. Again, their position changes, but the overall shape remains constant. And zooming in on a small section of the Trout River, a wild and scenic river in Vermont, you can also see that dynamic nature of the river over a 20-25 year period here with the meanders growing, changing, shifting, etc. This dynamic nature of rivers, we largely don't even sort of see that happening, if you will, don't appreciate that happening until it impacts us in terms of roads washing out, as here in another part of Vermont in 2011 during Tropical Storm Irene. And then zooming back at the Trout River again, we can see that this one meander moved 150 feet in 30 years, basically through an agricultural field where nobody was paying much attention to it, probably except the farmer whose land this was occurring on. But then, as it approached the road, my red arrow indicating sort of alarm bells setting off. And you can see in the bottom photograph that the meander did eventually reach or approach the road, and then the backhoes were out trying to stabilize it. So no concern really until that dynamic nature of the river starts impacting humans. So, what causes rivers to be dynamic, and how do we manage these rivers in a manner that's consistent with the dynamic nature of rivers? And that's the sort of the context of this report is trying to allow these rivers to be rivers, if you will, allow them to have their natural processes as much as possible. And the answer to that question, why are rivers dynamic, really just boils down to the simple statement flowing water carries sediment. Even a trickle of snow melt across a road is capable of moving some small particles of sediment. But of course, if you scale that up during a river flood, then we can imagine a lot more sediment and a lot larger sediment can be carried, and this is what's creating these changes along rivers. The dynamic nature really owes itself to the sediment in motion. Looking at this meander in Montana, we can see, we can imagine that the water is flowing uh, around the meander, but you also keep in mind that sediment is moving along the meander as well. The water might have a transit time through the meander of a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. Maybe there's an eddy somewhere, so some molecules of water are taking several hours to get around the meander. But in the case of sediment, the transit time through the meander might be, for a single particle of sediment, might be days, months, years, even decades or centuries, as some of that sediment will be deposited on point bars on the inside bend of the meander, and then uh, other particles of sediment are being eroded from the outside bend. So we think of a river as being stable, geomorphically stable or in equilibrium if the same amount of sediment is moving through the meander, not the same particles of sediment, but if we have sort of an equal volume of sediment moving through the meander, we would call that stable. That allows the river to move and shift, uh, but still remain stable. So if we look at this, these series of cross sections done in the 1950s in Maryland, we can see that the river channel was shifting to the left, eroding the riverbank to the left here, while at the same time depositing sediment on the point bar on the right. But what you should notice is that the sort of the shape and size of the channel has remained constant through that period of the cross sections. So indicating that the river is maintaining its shape, is sort of a stable, constant shape, even though it is shifting and moving. In fact, for a river to maintain that sort of equilibrium with the sediment flowing through it, it has to be able to shift. It has to be dynamic in order to maintain that stability or equilibrium. So I pose a question here as I present sort of the second concept of river processes is that stability does not equal staticness. Which of these rivers is the most stable or resilient? If we look at the Los Angeles River in California, sort of cemented and concreted in, unable to move and shift, uh, we would think, oh, that doesn't change, so maybe that's the stable one. But in terms of river processes, that's not the case. It's the channel that's able to move and shift. The Klamath River in California, shortly after the dams were moved, basically, this photo was taken in the old impoundment area, and we can see that the river is capable of moving and shifting and adjusting across that old impoundment, and that is able to sort of maintain its stability, resiliency to sort of changes. The Los Angeles River, if that concrete breaks anywhere, we would expect rapid and dramatic changes along the river. The channel's shape would change very, very quickly if that sort of concrete failed at any one place. Whereas the Klamath River would be able to shift and move and maintain that shape, even though it's shifting across the valley floor. So, what sorts of things sort of upset that sediment movement? Because that's where we start to see sort of the dramatic erosion and dramatic deposition, is where that sort of sediment transport is changed rapidly. In some cases, that can be the result of natural conditions listed on the left, and on many rivers, there's human land uses along the river that are highlighted in the sketch that can upset that movement of sediment and create sort of dramatic erosion problems. That's the focus of our talk today, but deposition also as well. So here's what looks like an idyllic natural river in Massachusetts, but in fact, this river was artificially straightened, which makes the stream more energetic, if you will, flows faster, capable of moving more sediment. And you'll notice there's no sediment accumulating in this straightened section of river. And in fact, all that sediment is moving downstream, and where it sort of uh, and where it re-enters sort of the natural meandering section of river downstream is where we might see large amounts of sediment deposited. So we're concentrating sediment in one area rather than distributing it evenly across the whole length of the river. And so as this gravel bar in the sort of upper photograph grows, the water is diverted into the opposite bank. If you're unaware of how the sediment transport has been affected by this human manipulation, this channel straightening, in this case, immediately upstream of this large gravel bar is a straightened channel, similar to what I just showed you. Uh, and then they did a bank stabilization project, sort of not appreciating how the straightened channel upstream was sort of impacting the area. And that bank stabilization project lasted just a few months, in part because they did not appreciate the forces of the extra sediment being transported by the Straighten River upstream. So that brings me to sort of a third adage of river processes is that rivers don't like fast changes. Their dynamic nature, they're trying to eliminate the fast changes. And so to help you understand where erosion problems might be worse, you basically you're looking for the fast changes along the river. So here in on the Bear River in Newry, Maine, I might not have pointed out I live in Portland, Maine. Much of my work is in New England, so a lot of my examples are from New England today. But these processes and examples you can find across the country and around the world. But again, forgive me for focusing on New England for those of you elsewhere in the country. But here we can see the channel has been artificially straightened and ends at this higher riverbank, the multiple contour lines indicating sort of a steep rise. Photograph showing you this coming down the straightened channel and impacting this bank. The old natural channel was sort of off in the woods here. You can see the vestiges of it on the topographic map. You'll see the natural channel just took a glancing blow along this high bank, but by artificially straightening the channel, you've created a hard, sharp bend, so a fast change in the turning of the water, and that creates sort of excess energy expenditure on the bank, which creates this erosion problem seen here. Another example from Ponacussing Creek in Pennsylvania. This is a wild and scenic river, and there was a subtle adjustment over 100 years ago, probably, where they realigned the channel. The sort of original channel again took a glancing blow along the roadway here. The road might not have even been there when this channel was first realigned. But then when they realigned the channel, it took this sharper bend. And that sharp angle of attack is what's sort of creating the erosion problem. And in this case, that resulted in sort of erosion and into the road and closure of the road as a result. And the river flows along the road for 2 miles along here, and the only place we had a problem is where the channel had been artificially manipulated and created this sort of sharp attack angle. This fast change is where the road failed. And that's not happenstance, it's precisely because of this fast change is why the river failed at this location, or why the road failed at this location and nowhere else along the 2 miles where the river flows along the road. Another example from the Klamath River, the dams were recently, 4 dams were recently removed, draining the old impoundments behind the dams. This reflects a fast change in elevation. So the river, all the tributaries used to flow into the impoundment at this level where the red dashed line is. But then when we dropped the river level, all these tributaries were sort of steepened a little bit, and that's created erosion problems. Well, not problems, but has created erosion as the river adjusts, or as the tributaries adjust to the new sort of Klamath River level. And this erosion we should not perceive as a problem here. We should perceive this as the tributaries adjusting to the new uh, sort of dam free condition, and the river will eventually stabilize itself if that erosion is allowed to occur and progress. So that brings us to the second part of the report and this talk, which is how do we select an appropriate bank stabilization technique? The first option we should always consider is sort of a do nothing option. Is there really a problem with the erosion? Again, think of erosion as the channel adjusting itself towards an equilibrium condition, or maintaining an equilibrium condition, or maintaining stability, trying to reach stability or maintaining stability. So if the erosion is not impacting anything, impacting a outstanding resource, if you will, then we're better off doing nothing. Allow the river to proceed through its dynamic processes. Uh, in the report sort of outlines these different options. The next option would be to look at off-site measures. Are there things we can do off-site to reduce the erosive pressures? If the erosion is the result of excess deposition downstream of a straightened channel, for example, is there something we can do to sort of remedy the excess energy in the straightened channel? Then, only then, after considering do nothing and offsite measures, uh, can we consider sort of actual bank stabilization techniques at the erosion site, looking at surface treatments, sort of treating right on the bank itself, or sticking things out from the riverbank to deflect flow away from the bank. These are sort of a couple of different treatment types or categories, if you will. So starting from the top, then the first thing is, can we just let the river sort of uh, maintain its dynamic nature and reach stability through that erosion and deposition? And this is where the concept of the river corridor comes in. In order for the river to maintain that equilibrium, it needs a certain amount of space in order to shift and migrate through time. And so in this sketch, which is in the report, we're sort of highlighting different conditions or different scenarios uh, where different treatments or no treatments might be needed. For example, in the lower right, we can see there's erosion approaching the road. So the first thing you might think is, can we, and the road is within the corridor, within the area we might expect the river to erode through time. So to prevent sort of constraining the river and preventing it from progressing through its dynamic uh, nature, if you will, we might consider relocating the road outside of the corridor so the river can continue uh, on its natural dynamic path, if you will. Elsewhere, the erosion is sort of within the corridor. There's no infrastructure nearby, so we're probably doing nothing. You might consider sort of some vegetation to slow that process of erosion, but really doing nothing would be fine, allowing the river to continue uh, with its dynamic processes. Only here, where the river's approaching some infrastructure, some homes, is where we might need to consider bank stabilization, assuming the homes can't be moved. Sort of the concept of a river corridor, illustrating an example from halfway around the world in Tajikistan, a little inset map there. Tajikistan is just north of Afghanistan. But here we can see that the river was straightened in the past and it is starting to reform meanders. And you can see sort of old meanders through the agricultural fields here. So, trying to understand that these meanders are growing by erosion from the outside bend. So, how far will that erosion continue? Well, looking at this aerial photograph, we can see that the old meanders extended quite a bit out into the valley in this case. And so this might be the river corridor, the zone we might expect these meanders to grow over time. So, would there be a way of sort of conserving this area, allowing natural processes to occur without constraining the river? Uh, Looks like there's some settlements and homes within the corridor. Most of the homes are outside the corridor in this case, which leads to fewer conflicts, if you will. But again, this is just trying to illustrate the concept of a corridor and how we would define or identify or map that corridor. And that's something that's becoming increasingly common in New England, certainly, and around the country, is sort of uh, creating corridor maps, trying to identify the areas within which the river would likely migrate over time. And these maps allow for uh, sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Prioritizing uh, river conservation easements, for example. And we're working with land trusts in New England who used to be focused on sort of upland areas, but now focusing them, at least in part, on sort of river bottom lands and the value of conserving lands along the river bottom to allow the river to migrate without sort of having this need to stabilize the river within the zone it would naturally occupy. So, by creating these river corridor maps, we can sort of identify the areas within which we would prefer to do nothing in terms of bank stabilization, allow the river to migrate naturally. And within this concept, we can also consider a number of off-site measures to reduce the erosive force on a riverbank without sort of trying to reduce the need for stabilization. The time scales might not be consistent. There might be a need to stabilize the bank right away, whereas the off-site measures might take literally decades to sort of help reduce erosive forces. But these are things, bigger picture, both in time and space, that we should be looking at doing. Uh, so along straightened channels, we can add wood to roughen and reduce the flow velocities and sediment transport. You can have log jams to sort of encourage meander growth. Again, sort of the area of concern here would be this eroding bank in red. So, what are some things we could do upstream to sort of reduce erosive forces? Removing sort of levees here that might be blocking side channels, the old meanders that were cut off during the straightening, for example. And then even within the eroding bank, what is there time before we need to stabilize. We might say, well, the river could erode to this point, the dashed line, before we would feel the urgency to stabilize the riverbank. And so we could have a period of monitoring, just keeping track of it before we immediately stabilize the bank and sort of prevent that natural dynamic river process from occurring. And so here are some examples of off-site measures, sort of wood additions to slow the water down to help trap sediment, building log jams to encourage meander growth, removing levees to allow the water to spread out on the floodplain to slow it down, disperse sediment on the floodplain. And then the Klamath, here's one of the Klamath River dams that was removed, removing dams, allowing that free flow, not only of water, but the free flow of sediment and return those natural processes as best as possible. Then, after considering doing nothing and off-site measures, then we can consider a number of different bank stabilization techniques sort of at the site of the erosion, breaking this down into surface treatments, a number of different types of surface treatments that can be used. This sort of live stakes, plantings, fascine bundles, uh, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are outlined in the report. I'm not going to go through all these in detail during the talk, but just sort of presenting the general outline to you today. But a lot of information in the report to dig into the details of these various treatments. Then we can also talk about flow deflection techniques, other set of treatments, things that sort of push the water away from the riverbank, reduce the erosive force on the bank itself, the use of marginal log jams built along the eroding bank, log sills, and also boulder deflectors. These deflectors, as we'll talk about, how do we prioritize which of these treatments we want to use? The log treatments are more natural. These are things you will see in nature, not sort of as well constructed as you can see, but mimicking natural features. uh, Boulder deflectors are not necessarily seen in nature. So, terms of wild and scenic river and national park service, these boulder deflector techniques are sort of lower on the prioritization list of the types of treatments you might use. Now, each of these treatments, I think there's 20 or so different types of treatments outlined in the report. Each one of these treatments has a fact sheet associated with it, sort of giving you a pictorial image and some details on how you might construct it. Then there's also a little narrative piece on their value and where you might use them. And then there's sort of little considerations, little details of how far the log jam should stick out relative to the width of the channel, things like that. So these are sort of two-page fact sheets. And these are in an appendix in the report. So all 20 of the treatments have a fact sheet associated with them. I'm just showing you one here to sort of outline how it's presented in the report. Also, we have a sort of flow chart which helps you decide which treatment you're going to use. Sort of step one, uh, can an erodible corridor be established? This is more or less asking, can we just let the river continue to erode and not do anything? So the do nothing option is the first thing you want to consider. Then step two is sort of outlined before, sort of what off-site measures can we do to reduce erosion. And you can do both, do off-site measures and move to step three, and sort of looking at bank stabilization. Again, sort of vegetation and wood treatments sort of given higher priority to the rock treatments, which are sort of less natural. So the red ones here at the bottom would be sort of a last case scenario. No other options going to work because the river's about to erode into a high value building like a hospital or something. Then maybe we want to consider these, but otherwise, we're looking more towards the vegetative treatments, of which there is plenty and which they are quite effective in most scenarios. Now, there might be multiple techniques under consideration, and then you have to get into the details of the particular site. Is this a high energy system, steep high energy? Are we looking at the treating the upper bank or the toe of the bank? Is this sandy material or clay material? Questions like this is going to determine exactly which treatment you might consider. So all of the 20 or so treatments that are considered in the report are shown on the left here, and then sort of color and shape coded uh, diagrams here to sort of indicate which treatments might be best. So the green circles, the green suggesting this is a good treatment to use. So sort of all the offsite measures are generally good in all scenarios to consider. That's why we see so much green there. But then from a wild and scenic or national park service perspective, uh, things we don't want to use or only consider in a last case scenario are sort of the red triangles, the sort of rock deflectors, and sort of rock revetments or riprap treatments. You'll see a lot of red there. Again, trying to maintain that natural river process is the goal of this document, especially when in use in wild and scenic river systems or national park service. So, again, we don't really have time to delve into the nitty gritty of this diagram. But if you are dealing with a bank erosion problem where you're considering the treatment type to use, then this is a chart you might want to look at in greater detail, explained in greater detail in the report as well. Finally, in terms of what's in the report, we have there are a number of resources available to study the problem, to better understand the erosion problem, which is going to help you identify the best treatment to use, including the possibility of doing nothing. So you want to look at topographic maps, aerial photographs, soils, surficial geology maps. In the field, you can map channel features, do topographic surveys, and certainly look at the bank stabilization literature in terms of what others have done. We are sort of summarizing in this report a lot of details that are available elsewhere. And within the report, there's a annotated bibliography of a number of other sort of bank stabilization documents as well. So there's more to learn beyond what's just in this report, and plenty of resources available to learn more about the erosion at your particular site wherever you are. So again, like we had fact sheets for the different bank stabilization techniques, there's also a fact sheet for all of these river resources I just listed. So here's an example of topographic surveying showing a riverbank that was monitored over a 3-year period, showing how the sort of riverbank in this case receded 7.5 feet just in the first month or two of the monitoring. But then subsequent to that, the sort of block of sediment that fell off the top of the bank just sort of slowly melted down into the river over the ensuing couple of years. So this helps you understand how fast the erosion is occurring if you have time to monitor and sort of decide what the best approach is based on how severe the erosion problem is. And so there's a fact sheets for all of these. This is the example of topographic surveying. These are also sort of two-page fact sheets that sort of outline what the resource can tell you and the different types of things you can learn from it. So again, in another appendix is all these fact sheets giving you more information on how to use aerial photographs, topographic maps, etc. So, sort of the three river process adages to remember is something just to keep as you're moving forward with these things, just little pithy statements to remember. Flowing water carries sediment. That's the basis of everything, sort of the dynamic river nature. Stability equals staticness. If you're sort of freezing things in place, with a permanent bank stabilization, you're potentially upsetting river stability. So you want to sort of weigh the need for bank stabilization against how you might be affecting sort of the natural dynamic nature of the river. And then to understand where your problems areas are, where the worst problems might be, is keep in mind rivers don't like fast changes. So look for those fast changes on the landscape because that can help you sort of pinpoint where the worst problems might be along the river system. So again, this is the report. I'm going to go through a sort of couple of example scenarios, sort of working through how this might work in a particular case. But just again, if you didn't scribble down the URL earlier and would like to, uh, just I'll stall here for a second. Maybe a quick snapshot with your phone might be easier than trying to scribble it all down. But anyway, and at the end, I can keep this slide up while we're answering questions as well. But let's look at a couple of examples. I think Risa may have sent these handouts to you earlier, or they might be available in the uh, chat box even, or uh, there might be a folder associated with the talk where these two handouts might be located that I showed earlier, the flow chart and then this sort of uh, technique prioritization table, let's call it. But we'll sort of use that. If you have these available to you, then you can sort of keep them in mind as we go through a couple of examples of how we would use this to help us identify the need for stabilization and what we might do. Here's an example from the Nissitissit River in New Hampshire. This is a wild and scenic river. Here's a steep, high eroding bank. And so, does this need stabilization? If it does, what technique might we use? So, uh, here's an aerial photograph of this site. Sort of the erosion I just showed you is the whiter tone on the aerial photograph here. There are some homes, but they're 300 feet away. And then we can see sort of the river corridor is sort of well outlined by the grayer deciduous vegetation that hasn't leafed out yet in this May photograph, 2015, I believe. And then the evergreens on the higher ground here. So the corridor is sort of well, so the erosion is sort of into the edge of the corridor, but do we sort of need to do any bank stabilization? So sort of pasting in this chart here, we can the erodible corridor be established? Can we, is there any infrastructure that's threatened? The homes are 300 feet away. Uh, so I can sort of jump ahead here. Looking at his aerial photographs on Google Earth, we'll see since 1995, in a 20-year period, the bank receded about 25 feet, so a little more than a foot per year. And the homes are 300 feet away. So there's no real threat here. It's going to be sort of 250 years before there's really going to be any potential issue with infrastructure. This is where we might want to consider conservation easements. Is there any sort of building pressure closer to uh, the riverbank? We want to maybe take measures to sort of prevent sort of new developments from encroaching closer to the river, in which case there might be concerns with the erosion, but uh, without the sort of jumping back here. Uh, so basically, there's no real need for erosion. We can pretty much say preserve the erodible corridor, maybe a little conservation easement along the edges of the corridor, and basically no need to stabilize. Basically, in this example, we can stop at step one, and there's no real urgency to stabilize the riverbank in any way. And so we can just more or less stop right there. Let's look at another example. Here on the Fremont River in Utah, which is within Capitol Reef National Park. I'll be honest with you, this is an example from some of the other authors on the report that I'm not familiar with, but but I think I can carry forth with the example here. This is within the national park. This is old orchard lands um, on the floodplain, so there's sort of historical value to this. So uh, my colleagues are sort of torn whether they can allow the natural processes to continue here. Looking at this from an aerial photograph perspective, this is where that ground photograph just was. You can see some of the old orchard trees. So there's some historical value to maybe preserving this area, or do we allow the natural process to continue? Looking at the topographic map, probably from the 1980s, you will see that the river channel is actually artificially straightened, it appears, and that the meanders that we're seeing are actually the river reforming meanders, sort of reestablishing its natural configuration. So this erosion and meander reformation is sort of the river naturally adjusting back to its sort of natural stable condition. And so the question is, do we allow that to continue at the expense of this sort of historical resource value? Or do we do some sort of stabilization technique? I think the managers of this site along in the national park here are still sort of uh, fighting, or not fighting, but still what's the word? They're still trying to sort this out. Do they stabilize, which might prevent the river from sort of naturally adjusting itself from the previous straightening, or is this resource worth preserving and preventing its continued erosion? So here, maybe you're stopping at step one, but let's look sort of further in the chart here. Are there offsite measures that can be taken? Uh, see upstream of where this erosion is occurring, we have the Sulphur Creek tributary coming in. Again, I'm not familiar with this area, but what immediately comes to my mind is a lot of this erosion and meander reformation being driven by sort of sediment inputs from Sulphur Creek, and what sort of off-site measures might be taken along Sulphur Creek that could reduce the amount of sediment and perhaps slow the rate of erosion to a point where, the threat to the resource is of less of a concern. So that's what I mean by off-site measures. Is there something we can do elsewhere which would reduce the erosive pressures at site? So that would be sort of step two. And so we could select appropriate off-site measures, adding wood upstream to help trap sediment and slow the transport of sediment. But even if you identified an off-site measure to take, that might not sort of mean we don't have to do stabilization. So that's what this sort of side angled arrow is, bringing us back to the next step, looking at vegetative treatments. Okay, and then we got to look at the flow energy. Is this a high energy system? My sense from the gravel bar that in that ground photograph I showed you, this is probably a high energy system. So we don't want to go to low and just plant willow stakes or plant trees along the bank, because the erosion's probably too aggressive for those trees to become established before they would be eroded away. So then maybe we're looking at sort of high energy treatments or techniques appropriate for high energy settings. And then here is the setting appropriate for flow deflection structures. And a good place for flow deflection structures is where you have a large gravel bar or sandbar on the opposite bank, because the flow deflection might sort of eat away at the bar, but it's not going to eat away at the opposite riverbank, for example. So this is a sort of an appropriate setting for flow deflection structure. Doesn't mean you couldn't use surface treatments. But you might consider flow deflection structures in this particular example. And my colleague said they were looking at potentially some log sills as a flow deflection structure at this case. So in this example, we're sort of landing here in this sort of step three example. And so here are some possible treatments that would meet the bill. The flow deflection structures, sort of marginal log jams or log sills might be appropriate, because there is that sort of wide gravel bar that on the opposite bank. So we're not going to impact sort of the opposite bank, just the sort of bar within the channel. And then surface treatments that might also be appropriate could be one or others of the vegetative treatments. I'm just recycling slides from earlier in the talk, but looking at all of the treatments, there are other possibilities as well. And again, it really depends on the details of the site, the soil types. Some again, these are the problem my colleagues are working on. I'm not intimately familiar with it in terms of exactly which site or which technique might be used. This is where you'd want to get into the weeds of all these colored dots and shapes, but again, I can't go into every detail of the sort of uh, techniques as well as the aspects of the site you want to think about in selecting the technique. But again, this is a valuable table when you start getting into the nitty gritty. Then let's come back to Ponacussing Creek as a third example of how we might use this flow chart, where we have this realigned channel, which is sort of eroding into the road. My understanding is the town through the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation uh, are going to rebuild this road. So, what techniques sort of might be appropriate in this case? Looking at the aerial photograph, you can get a better idea. Here's the sort of the original channel, which just took a glancing blow along the edge here, whereas that slight realignment of the channel sort of increases the angle of attack against the road, and that's what sort of caused the road to fail. So we could look at off-site treatments, if you will. What's the possibility of realigning the channel back into its original natural path and sort of reduce the erosive forces along the road? That might be something that should be considered, but would not sort of eliminate the need for stabilization along the road as well, but it would reduce the erosive forces. We have to keep in mind that the rest of the 2 miles along this road are already heavily armored with walls and riprap along it. And so when we start considering what treatment type we want to use, we can get back to where we were with the last techniques. With the last example at step 3, maybe sort of these marginal log jam sort of flow deflection structures. Not sure if flow deflection structures are really going to work here. You got a lot of private land. The channel's relatively narrow. You're going to have, you know, lots of people upset with you if you're deflecting flow into their yard. So I don't really see flow deflection structures uh, being appropriate or working well. The road is right here, critical infrastructure right along the road. So we're sort of making our way down through the techniques, and we already have armor along 2 miles of road. Mixing and matching techniques, I'm always nervous about on bank stabilization projects. You want to avoid sort of rapid changes in the type of technique you're using is also one of these fast changes where you might expect problems to arise. Remember, rivers don't like fast changes, so those contact areas can sometimes be problematic. So this is an example where you might make it down to the end of your technique uh, and looking at rock treatments, basically replicating the rock wall or riprap along the other 2 miles of river. The Wild and Scenic River was this section of river was designated with the riprap in place. So again, in general, you want to avoid making your way down to the bottom of the table here, looking for other treatments before you settle on sort of the rock armoring. But in this case, uh, given the critical infrastructure right up against the bank, as well as the existing bank stabilization techniques being used, that's likely where you would land in going through this table in this example. So again, wanted to give you 3 examples, sort of landing you at different places on this chart so you can sort of see how this chart can be useful as you deal with a bank stabilization problem on your own. Again, if you've enjoyed this presentation, you can get a whole lot more and then some as part of a 3-day short course I'll be offering through the River Management Society, scheduled this year for November 17th through 19th. You can find information on the uh, River Management Society's website or by quickly clicking on that URL there. Uh, and with that, I'll open the floor up for questions from anybody and everybody. And if you have specific problem areas you're looking at and wondering how you might use this table. We can have questions like that or more general ones about anything. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We had one question early from Tom Casson. Who could a town or organization hire to assist with plotting a corridor map for a certain area?
Well, I guess you'd be looking for a fluvial geomorphologist, river geologist. That's my specialty. Um, really understanding the sort of longer term history, sort of even the pre-history in terms of sort of pre-documentation. So going back hundreds of years, if you will, to understand where the river was in the past and moving into the future. So ultimately, that's what you're looking for: fluvial geomorphologist. A lot of the larger sort of engineering or environmental uh, consulting firms, a lot of them now have fluvial geomorphologists on staff, or slowly will have them on staff.
Tom, maybe tell us where you're from. There might be others who might know somebody else near you. Avon, Connecticut. He's pretty close.
Connecticut. Well, maybe I can help you.
Any other folks have questions? Yeah, Michael, just come on off mute. There you go.
Hi, yeah. Hey, thanks so much, John. This is really helpful. I had a question about kind of when you were mentioning on wild and scenic rivers, kind of talking about the acceptable kind of level of erosion towards infrastructure. And I was curious how you think about like agricultural lands or irrigated field where maybe it's not necessarily infrastructure or a house or something, but it's kind of like in use.
Right. From a general perspective, there's uh, some added details within the Wild and Scenic River program. If you're within a Wild and Scenic River system, I think with I think that's where you're going to end up in that middle ground of that table with the flow deflection techniques or wood-based surface treatments or even sort of plantings if it's a lower energy system where you might be able to get those plants established before. I've been doing a lot of work over the last decade or so with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, basically serving farmers concerned with erosion. They have various programs. Usually, if the sort of farmer is willing to uh, uh, create a small corridor, if you will, sort of 35 feet, I think is the minimum. Ideally, NRCS is looking for like 100 feet where you're willing to uh, turn that back into riparian corridor, basically planting trees along there. Then they're generally willing to look at bank stabilization techniques to slow the erosion down long enough to reestablish a healthy forest along the edge of the agricultural field. So that sort of takes some willingness on the landowner's part to sort of give up a little bit of that land, but long term, it's ultimately in their favor. And there's a number of programs also that will compensate the landowner for giving up that strip of land. You would have expected to earn, so many dollars over so many years for uh, if you were still farming that land, and then just basically giving a cash buyout to allow the corridor to be established. So, so working with land conservations, land trust organizations, as well as Natural Resources Conservation Service. Some have chosen to do that. thinking of the long term and preserving their land over just the short term uh, uh, value of the crops they'd be growing there.
Here's another question. Michael, you good?
Uh, I was just going to follow that up real quick on, is that kind of on the landowner to make that decision, or is there more kind of, is that more of a requirement?
Well, in many cases, it might be a requirement to access those sort of NRCS funds, yes, but it's ultimately up to the landowner to decide whether they want to access those funds or not. But it's ultimately the landowner's choice. But
Oh, good, Michael. So here's another question, John. It's from Ray Kelsey from Utah. Have you been involved in alewife restoration projects in New England or elsewhere?
not directly, I'm familiar with a lot of dam removals in Maine related to alewife restoration that I've been tangentially involved in. Particularly the Sebasticook River in Maine, there's been a number of dam removals, primarily intended for alewife restoration, as well as elsewhere in Maine.
So Tom from Connecticut asks, are there any resources in New England to assist with dam removal? My land trust has an opportunity to acquire a wetlands with a known dam, but there is a concern on cost of removal and negative repercussions downstream.
Yeah, my colleague Jim McCartney might have a better answer to that question than I do. I mean, the short answer is yes. What particular, I mean, there's federal resources available. That's a changing landscape now, but I think there's still sort of requests for proposals going out from various federal agencies. Uh, I'm not too familiar with Connecticut, but I imagine there's state resources available um, for dam removals as well as some maybe nonprofit groups. But again, Jim, chime in if you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not hearing myself. Um, um, yeah, I think the short answer, Tom, is there are some resources in the past, the federal agencies that have assisted with a lot of these projects uh, um, is the Department of Commerce, NOAA, and specifically National Marine Fisheries, so that they do a lot of dam removal projects, both funding and technical assistance. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well has some programs. Primary distinction between the two is NOAA is more focused on migratory fish that have they're catadromous, so spending part of their life cycle in saltwater as well as fresh. And then Fish and Wildlife Service tends to be more focused on freshwater fisheries resources. You can probably also reach out to Connecticut Deep, the environmental agency for the state. They can probably help out as well.
Thanks, Jim. I also put American Rivers contact there. So, John, another question. In determining the natural river corridor, would it suffice to use 100-year floodplain as a rule of thumb, knowing it is likely to change over time with climate change?
The problem with using the 100-year floodplain is it's part yes, part no. There's a lot of overlap in the river corridor and the sort of regulatory 100-year floodplain. What the river corridor mapping establishes is not only the sort of flood, well, it's not really focused on the flood inundation. The 100-year floodplain is looking at the inundation. The water comes out of the channel and spreads across the floodplain. Whereas the corridor is looking at where is the channel potentially going to migrate. It's looking more at erosion hazards, sort of where might the erosion be occurring. In some cases, the erosion might be occurring outside the 100-year floodplain limits, especially where it's eroding into high riverbanks that are sort of higher than the inundation level of a 100-year flood. Whereas in other cases, on very wide floodplains, the river might inundate a much wider area than the river channel itself might be expected to migrate over a 100-year time period. So again, there's similarities in the limits of those, but not necessarily. And in New England, at least, as well as North Carolina after Helene, there's it really opened people's eyes to erosion hazards and where erosion can occur. The type of hazard, severity of hazard is much greater than the sort of inundation hazard. And sometimes those are occurring beyond the limits of the 100-year floodplain. And so that's why sort of these corridor maps are a useful supplement to the 100-year FEMA flood maps.
Okay, got another one. When this is Tom again. When studying aerial photo to determine the direction of erosion or migration, is there a minimum number of photos over a certain time period you should be looking for?
Oh, you want to be looking at as much as you can find. Aerial photographs, the earliest aerial photographs, at least widely available, are from the 1930s. So that's giving you a 100-year history in many places around the country. In rare instances, you can find some from the 20s. But you can also look at historical topographic maps. All of these are available on the United States Geological Survey website. And in in some cases, the historical topographic maps, certainly in New England, in some cases go back to sort of 1880s and 1890s, that can provide some generally accurate information on where the river channel was. So that can extend your sort of look back in time even further. I would also add you want to be looking at flood histories. Sometimes your most severe erosion is occurring during large floods, so uh, you you want to be capturing in your sort of analysis. You want to sort of bracket before and after large floods. So that's why it's hard to give you a specific range of time you want to be looking at, because the sort of floods are occurring randomly over various time scales. So you can't sort of specify, oh, 20 years is enough, that kind of thing. You really want to look at all of your resources as far back as you can. In New England, you can even dig into historical archives and sometimes find old maps where they did some ground surveys of where the river channel was, going back to 1850s. In some cases I found in New England, but you're on mute, Lisa.
If you were to look at like one of the big areas you referenced before after Hurricane Irene, could you look up Hurricane Irene and find stuff about what happened during that period of time because it was so dramatic?
Well, shortly after Irene, I was looking up just news reports on it. A number of people had before and after satellite images. So,
Mhm.
so just over a couple year period. just because Irene itself created river systems that, widened by tens or hundreds of feet. And so the
Mhm.
before and after images were dramatic.
Mhm. One more question from Michael. Do you know the name of the NRCS program that compensates landowners for allowing river channels to move?
Again, Jim might be able to chime in too. I know one of them is EQIP. Don't even know what that stands for anymore, but Environmental Enhancement Program or something like that. So EQIP is one. They're changing. There are others. There's RCPP is larger programs that are sort of in the last couple years where they're looking at sort of watershed scale restoration in some cases. Um, so those are two that immediately come to mind. Again, Jim, chime in if you remember the names of some of the others.
Yeah, I think one of them previously was referred to as the Conservation Reserve Program or the Conservation Reserve
CO.
Enhancement Program.
Correct.
That
Yep,
was
that's
used to set aside buffers. And the difference between the two was the payout per acre or linear foot. I think it may go by a
Hopefully
different
that
name
helped.
these days, but I'm not sure what.
Yeah, every county in the country pretty much has a local NRCS office, so certainly worth calling them directly, and they'll be more than happy to share the available programs.
Well, also, when we send the notes, we'll see if we can find a couple of URLs also, or if there's a national one. Michael. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Oh, while we're waiting for any final, we have just a couple of quick final slides, but I'm going to ask James to put a link to a survey in the chat. To get some feedback from you. And this, I mentioned at the top, we have one more Wild and Scenic Rivers webinar coming up in a few weeks. And Kelsey Mackey from the National Park Service is going to talk about visitor use management, wild and scenic rivers, and kind of where you can implement VOM protocols and approaches to your wild and scenic rivers. And we'll have some breakouts. It'll be kind of an interactive session. That'll be good. And yep, there's the survey, and we just have one more slide to thank everybody for being here. If you have any suggestions on wild and scenic river topics that you'd like to hear about, we're beginning to plan next year. You know, and one thing that occurred to me when you had that overhead shot, John, of when you were talking about rivers don't like fast changes, nor do they like fast changes of approaches or materials. You had that kind of corner. It reminded me that it might seem odd to be talking about riprap and appropriate treatment on a wild and scenic river because it's riprap, but so this isn't a wild river, nor it might not be a scenic river. It's probably a recreational river if it's wild and scenic because it's already built. So what's important to remember is your built condition helps you know what was there before. So you might have a value that your values and the description of your base river might include riprap, which doesn't sound wild and scenic, right? But it's the case with recreational rivers.
Yeah, good point.
Well, if everyone's going to be shy and no more questions, we can let you go back to the rest of your day. So thank you so much, John, for being here. And thank you for all the folks who attended. We'll post the recording in a day or two. I'll include the chat, not all the questions, but the questions, some of the main questions, so you can remember, you know, some of the things that we talked about. And thank you for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you.